Hey, what is up everyone? It's Emily and welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to do another discussion video about tropes and how tropes are being used in marketing for books. But before we get started, be sure to let me know down below in the comments which tropes are your favorite or least favorite to read. So to start this off, let's just talk about, what is a trope? And a trope is a literary device that authors use that is familiar to readers, that is very commonplace and conventional within a story. So a good example in fantasy is the chosen one. So most commonly known would be something like Harry Potter, where he's the chosen one and he's going to defeat this evil. There are a lot of really well-known ones in romance, like friends to lovers, miscommunication trope, the one bed trope, enemies to lovers, I probably already said that, found family, all these kinds of things. These are all very familiar, conventional things that we use in books. Every single genre uses them. Every book you've probably ever read, aside from nonfiction, is probably using tropes. A trope is not a cliche necessarily. It is just a tool that is used to kind of give readers a grounding for the book and the story. They help define the genre, and they also tell readers what to expect. So when you pick up a book and you read the back of it, or you look at the cover, or the title, they all kind of give you an idea of what this book's going to be about. You'll kind of know from the cover, this is going to be enemies to lovers, or this is going to be a workplace drama, or this is going to be a slasher horror book. All of those kinds of things you can pretty much tell right away, and those are all tropes that authors use to kind of give readers an understanding of what the book is going to be, to see if it's something that they would enjoy. It also gives people a really familiar place to start from. For me, this is really important in fantasy because when you're setting up a new world, area, idea, having these tropes in place can really give you an understanding of where you are, even if you're still learning about everything else in the world. An example of this could be Sanderson's Mistborn series, where his first book is very much an apprentice and mentor situation going on here. Like, that's kind of his trope mixed in with a heist. So even though we're learning about this epic fantasy world, all these new characters, magic systems, and everything else, the story itself is something very familiar to readers that they will understand from the get-go. The pitfall that a lot of books fall into is that if they don't put their own originality or twist into these tropes, it can become very factory-like, carbon copy-like, and kind of boring to readers. A lot of books also will subvert tropes, so the chosen one maybe doesn't want to have magic powers and refuses them, or the chosen one is a 65-year-old man instead of a teenage boy. There's also the bad boy, good girl cliche, and flipping those can sometimes be really interesting. These are all just ways to make these very familiar themes and ideas fresh and new every time you read a book. However, what I feel like I've been seeing recently is an influx of books that are basing the foundation of their story on tropes, whereas tropes should be tools to further a plot. Instead of having a really thought out plot and world with very dynamic characters, we're seeing people who are just writing an enemies to lovers book. And in my opinion, that really doesn't have a very good grounding. You need a lot more to that story to make it interesting and unique and to stand out in the market, especially with a market as flooded right now as publishing. Or they're using tropes as a marketing tool where maybe the trope isn't actually a very big part of the story. So for example, I'm going to use enemies to lovers because I feel like that one is really popular right now and you see it all the time and it's something that readers want to see, right? So I feel like if you sell a book on the idea of enemies to lovers, but the romance is a subplot to the book, it leaves the readers really unsatisfied because your book isn't fulfilling on the promises that you gave your readers. So we're seeing publishers and authors promoting their books as, this is enemies to lovers and this is going to have the one bed trope and all of these other things. And they're getting readership based on those tropes because they know that that's what people want to see, but then they're not fulfilling those promises that is being made because maybe the romance isn't a big part of the story, or maybe, they promised an enemies to lovers, but it's really more of like strangers to lovers. People don't necessarily want to read strangers to lovers, so they're calling it enemies to lovers, and then now things are getting all gobbled up and confusing, and people are very dissatisfied with how a book is panning out. And I think it's really hard to do because you can't just put a strong female character as your main character and expect that book to be good. And people are writing books like that, marketing it as, yep, we have a strong female protagonist and the villain is actually going to be the good guy all along. And then now, not only have you given away most of your book, but also if you don't have developed and interesting characters, it doesn't matter that you're putting in these tropes. Like, the book won't be interesting, it won't be good, and people are not going to like your book. So for me, I think the issue is stemming from not the tropes themselves, it's how people are using them in their books and in their marketing. And I think this is also coming down to the way we are recommending books to other people, because it's not all on the authors or the publishers, the marketing itself, but we as the community are also marketing books in a way, right? Like every time you recommend a book, you are marketing that book, people are seeing that book, and people are taking that recommendation and potentially buying it. I see this a lot on YouTube and on Book Talk, and I have done it myself, so I am in no way bashing anyone who does this, but a lot of the times when we recommend books, we'll say, oh, it's a friends to lovers book set in college. And that doesn't really tell anyone anything about the book except that it's friends to lovers. And something I hadn't even thought of is that a lot of times that's a spoiler for the end of the book. I mean, I know we read romances because you want them to end up together or you want to follow the journey of this individual. It's friends to lovers kind of is telling you the entire idea of the whole plot that's going on. But the thing that makes books interesting is what happens outside of those tropes, or how the author is using those tropes. What is the author bringing to the characters? Is it a really diverse book with interesting characters? Is it set in a world that's completely unlike our own? What is happening outside of the friends to lovers romance that makes this book stand out and interesting to unique readers? I noticed for a really long time, especially in 2020, 2021, is that everyone was reading Six of Crows, which is a fine book. I read it, I liked it. But anytime someone was recommending a heist or a found family book, they recommended Six of Crows, even if it was nothing like that book whatsoever, because that is just how we were recommending books to people. And the thing is, that's not really a great way to recommend books to people, because is it the found family that they liked about it, or is it the diverse characters or the overall mood of the book? Those are all things that come into play when you're looking to recommend a book to somebody. So I think using tropes as the main way to tell someone else what a book is like, or if they're gonna like a book or not, I don't know if that's the best way to do it. And I could be wrong, but that's just me. I just don't think it is. And I think this is bleeding into why Book Talk books end up being really overhyped and disappointing to a lot of readers, because they're promised one thing based off of a trope that they love, and it's just really not living up to it. A good example for me that I personally think this fell into is The Atlas 6. I liked the book overall. It was fine, but it was nothing like people told me it was going to be. I was told that it was going to be a dark, almost gothic book about the Library of Alexandria, and I just feel like that's not what it was at all for me. I thought it lacked in plot, and there was just nothing happening until the end, and everyone made it sound like it was going to be exciting and thrilling, and that they were all going to be fighting to the death, and that is just not how the book was delivered whatsoever. But because of the way people were promoting it, using these different tropes and ideas, and using buzzwords to promote the book, it was reaching an audience that then was not enjoying it. I think the hard thing is we're using these buzzwords to get excitement and interest in a book, and it works. Clearly, we've seen that with many, many Book Talk books. But the thing is, you're using these buzzwords and excitement around it to market your book, to recommend a book, and then it's not living up to it because it's all it's based around. I also think what's happening a lot is we're using romance tropes to describe fantasy books where maybe the romance is a subplot. So let's say the enemies to lovers, because that's apparently where I am right now. Enemies to lovers is a subplot in a fantasy book, and that is how it's being promoted because that is what is selling right now. That is what people are interested in. So that's how they're marketing it. And then people are buying this book for this enemies to lovers romance, but it only takes up, let's say, 20% of the book because it's a fantasy book first and it has a story outside of that romance. And then everyone's like, well, this isn't enemies to lovers, right? Because they're using a trope not intended for that genre, or people aren't being honest about how large the romance is really taking up in the book. I think maybe what it boils down to is how important are tropes versus the plot and characters of a book. And for me, the plot and the characters are going to always be more important than what tropes are involved. In fact, I didn't even care about tropes before I was even on Book Talk. They were just interesting little side things that I could say were involved in a book to help someone else understand what was going on. And I wonder what's going to happen eventually when everyone is tired of reading the same trope over and over again. I mean, think about how oversaturated the market was 10 years ago with vampire books or werewolf books or teen YA dystopian books. You know, think about how oversaturated it was then. You know, what's going to happen in 2 years or less even when every book is enemies to lovers and no one wants to read that anymore? I don't know. I don't really have an answer. I just think it's good to keep talking about these things. Honestly, it makes me think back to the whole Lightlark thing where she was marketing her book based off only tropes and scenes written in her books that are also based off of tropes. And first of all, how well it is. I mean, have you guys seen how much this book has sold? It's crazy. Even with the hate bombing on her Goodreads, which is just, that's a whole other thing. I should do a part 2 to that video, honestly. But what's gonna happen when eventually that doesn't sell anymore? Are we gonna find new tropes to kind of fall into and fall in love with until we get bored of it again? And then I think what's happening is these books are underdeveloped. They have tropes that they're standing on, then the characters are underdeveloped because if you know one is the enemy and one is the lover, then do you need 3-dimensional characters? Is that what people are still looking for? Are they just looking for an easy romance where they don't have to think so much? And just with the mass amount of books that are coming out right now, there's just a lot out there that's very 2-dimensional. And it's all for the sake of making money, because at the end of the day, it's all a business, isn't it? So, I don't know. I don't really have strong opinions on this. I just think it's really interesting to talk about. Like I said, I never really cared about tropes prior to BookTube or especially BookTok, when it like really took off to talk about tropes. I just think it's really interesting to kind of reflect back and think, you know, why? Why do we buy certain books? Why do we like certain tropes? And how often are we buying those things just based off of the idea alone instead of the plot? Or like what the book actually contains, or if the book actually contains anything outside of it. It's just really interesting to me, something I want to explore more. Feel free to let me know your thoughts down below. I'd love to hear what everyone has to say. This is definitely an ongoing conversation and one that probably doesn't have an answer, and there is no right or wrong. If you love tropes, that's great. If you hate tropes, that's also great. At the end of the day, we just all love books, right? Well, I think that is going to be it for me today. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a like and subscribe to my channel. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I can't wait to see you in the next one.